Hi friends, Josh from the Narrate team here. This past weekend, Adam asked the question, what if our resources and possessions are a relational tool, test, and trademark?
So, Andy Stanley, to whom I'm indebted this morning, and by indebted I mean who I will shamelessly plagiarize, which incidentally I realized, so I'm taking another grad class from George Fox, that's where I got to be last weekend, and I realized while I was there that one of my most important skills is one that's not employable in my grad work. Turns out they frown upon plagiarism in that context, and so I've got a whole new skill set that I've got to develop. But Andy Stanley is a leader in Atlanta, Georgia, instrumental on us and in many ways. And his treatment of a particular narrative that we're going to look at this morning, I thought had some interesting insight to it. But he also told a story about his niece, Alina. Alina, at the time of incident that we're going to talk about, she was 9 years old. It was day one of her 4th year on the swim team. And up until this point, she'd been on the swim team because she loved swimming from a very young age. She loved the water. She was tall and lanky and kind of seemed to be perfect for the whole swim world. And so at 6 years old, her parents put her on a swim team, and she went to lots and lots of swim meets over the next several years, and she loved them. She loved every bit of it. She loved practice. She loved the meets. She loved the people. It was all very positive. But as parents are capable of doing, they started to get worried, and what they were worried about was the fact that she never won. And so their fear was that she was going to get discouraged and quit because she was never on the medal stand. She'd never even smelled the medal stand. And so they started to kind of overthink that. And so on this, the first day of her 4th season, at 9 years old, as her mom kind of finished writing, apparently you take a Sharpie and write the events for the day on a swimmer's wrist. I didn't know that. But as she was finishing up writing the events on her wrist, she looked at her daughter and she said, "Now, Alina, I want you to go win this first race." And at that, Alina's eyes got great big, and she looked at her mom, and she said, "It's a race?" You've been calling it a meet. Like, thought I was here to meet people. Now, every parent in the room can appreciate that moment, because at that moment, the mom got to have one of those parent moments where she realized that she was a complete failure as a mother, because for 3 years, somehow she'd failed to convey to her daughter that you try to win these swim meets. But nonetheless, she actually did win that race. And in fact, as the story goes, she won most every race for the rest of the year, and today she's the only girl from that pool who continues to swim. Now, what I love about that story is it captures this idea of perspective, right? Because we want different marriages, we want different checkbook ledgers, we want different work lives, we want lots of different things. And in some level, it captures the fact that it starts with how we see things, right? That the perspective that we have of the world, though not enough unto itself, it drives what we do and why we do the things we do. It's why therapists work so hard to understand, like, what are the beliefs, what are the values, what are the mental decisions behind the behaviors. And in many ways, her story captures that, because suddenly lots of things made more sense for Alina. The lanes made more sense. The cheering, the on your marks, get set, go. Like, the fact that her friends all had these fancy medals and she never got these medals, suddenly lots and lots of things made more sense. And listen, I don't know what your familiarity with the Bible is, but one of my abiding convictions is that we often treat it like it was written by these very intellectual people who were in ivory towers somewhere, and therefore to understand the Bible requires that we whisk ourselves away to some kind of academic setting and read about these esoteric abstract ideas, and it's simply not the case. In fact, in many cases, the scriptures are the narratives of very marginalized people who were very under-resourced, and at the very least had many of the same struggles that you and I have. In fact, Paul, I think, captures this in Romans 2. There's something he says that is often treated as this kind of religious barb that we use to have arguments on the ideology level, but he simply says this: "Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Now, that can be a Christian statement, a Christ-following statement, because it very much captures that if we want to live the life God wants us to live, we've got to see the world the way he sees it. But it's also just a statement. Again, it reinforces that our perspectives drive our behaviors and the way we interact relationally and socially and with our money and with everything else. So I guess to that end, what I want to begin to speak to is if you're someone who's new to this culture, and many of you are, and trying to understand what do we do and why do we do series and what does this look like, in my view, The value of Sunday is it's all about perspective. Like what I value is starting conversations that cause us to begin to go, and what we value as a staff, is starting these conversations that cause us to go, wait a minute, am I seeing that in the best possible way? Is there another way to see that? And what happens if I see this a little bit differently? What occurs at that point? Like what transpires if suddenly my perspective of this changes? So we're finishing up a series most recently on technology. Some of you loved that series. Some of you loathed that series. That's okay. My only purpose there was to start a conversation in which we go, wait a minute, are we thinking about the way we're interacting with our screens and our devices and the internet and how often we're turning to them? Listen, an environment where I say something and you all agree, you know what you call that? Very dangerous. It's called a cult. So the desire here is to start conversations that you begin to move toward and begin to interact about. Now, the other thing that means is that from periodically we have what we call one-off Sundays. This would be what we call a one-off Sunday, and what will cue you into a one-off Sunday for the rest of the year is we'll show that particular video. And I think sometimes we see one-off Sundays as these kind of commercial between the shows, between the program. And I just want you to know that's not the way I interact with it. It's not the way we value it. It's definitely not the way I think about it. See, sometimes we come up to an idea that's important to revisit. Like sometimes what we have to acknowledge is, listen, the natural tendency is to drift. And even though I know this and I believe this and I value this and I would check it off on a box and I would pass it on the test, doesn't mean I embrace it, because we naturally move away from things. In my mind, this technology conversation is one of those. I can't see a day where we'll do another series, but in my Evernote world where I'm researching and plagiarizing and personally learning, it will be a tab in my Evernote for the foreseeable future, constantly looking for new questions, new ideas, new stories, new research, because in my thinking, we're going to have to return to this every year or two. Not for weeks, but for a week. Because listen, at no point are you going to be sitting there watching TV or surfing the internet and have this inclination to do it less, right? And so there's this drift things that happens. Well, all of that to say, this morning, the conversation that I want to put on the table isn't a new one. For many of you, this is one you've built your life around, but it's still one that I think we need to have a conversation about intermittently, and it deals with relationships and resources. Some of you would call it money, and you're like, oh, I can't believe I came on the money week. Good news, it's really not the money week. And even better news, there's no aha at the end. There's no offering, no like budget shortfall. None of those things are the case. My motive for having this conversation is A, because I think we drift away from generosity normally, like just as the way life happens. But B, you know what's real, what's true of your life 6 weeks from now? Gotta stop and think of the date. You've ingested your Thanksgiving turkey 6 weeks from now. Which means most of the men in the room about 6 weeks from now have this panic-stricken feeling of like, duh, I still haven't bought a Christmas present, right? And you still haven't made plans for what you're going to do for Christmas, and whose family are we going to have mad at us, and whose family are we going to appease? And there's all this thing that happens with Christmas. And if you hear nothing else this morning, please hear me say this. The conversation I want to spark is how easily Christmas, and I love Christmas. We love Christmas. We have this giant party at the Civic Center. Love Christmas, all of it, even the pagan parts of it. Love it all. It's great. That was supposed to be a joke. Nobody laughed. But I'm serious. Like, I love it. There's so many fun things about Christmas, but here to me is the challenge. If we're not careful, we drift into it not being about relationships, but about these obligatory gifts that we don't really even feel any connection to. And I think that whole conversation sparks a bigger conversation about how we see stuff. And the relationship stuff has, that's not a very good sentence, the relationship stuff has with our relationships. Like, where do we prioritize one over the other? So Andy Stanley, he has a few observations from a particular text in Luke 16. And the story starts with a guy, and part of what I love about Jesus is his community was always so diverse. Like, Most churches are echo chambers where everybody votes the same way and does the same thing. And part of what we love about this is we said from the beginning, we want to be a place where people from both sides of the aisle can challenge one another and grow and challenge their party to be better. And I think that's true here. And in Jesus' audience, it was always a diverse crowd. You had men and women, that would have been rare. Adults and children, that would have been rare. You had wealthy, affluent people and poor, peasant people. You had it all. And most especially you had, usually off on the side, these religious people whose posture looked something like this. They were generally affluent, and Jesus generally said very harsh things to them. And yet, to me, the real danger is that when we read those stories, what we see Jesus doing is objectifying those people, not caring deeply for them. That it's so easy to read about the religious people that Jesus took issue with so many of their beliefs and not see that they were his friends. He had more in common with them than most. He was a religious leader. And he was trying to awaken them to the very same question he was awakening everyone else and us to, and that is, hey, would you think about your plans for living and whether or not you have the best possible perspective of those? Luke 16 seems to be one of those areas where Jesus very purposely is drilling down on and trying to capture the attention of affluent religious people. I don't know if you'd call yourself religious, but I know by the nature of being an American, the world would call you affluent. So let's listen to Luke 16. Well, actually, let's just go read it. In not Romans 16. That would be an altogether different sermon that I'm not prepared for. Jesus told the disciples, there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot manage any longer. Let's just humanize it. Jesus says to a crowd of people, listen, I understand how hard it is to get people to work for you and be honest as they do so. Listen, I understand how hard it is to be a manager. I understand how hard it is to be an owner. I understand how hard it is to find good employees who are willing to do an honest day's work. And he had them at hello because suddenly they're like, wow, this guy speaks our language. And so he tells a story about a manager who was stealing from the owner. And he continues, the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm too ashamed to beg. In other words, this manager suddenly comes to the realization that the only thing he's ever done is office work. He's a CPA. He's only ever worked as a CPA. He trained as a CPA. Everything in his life has channeled in that direction, and suddenly they're going to take away his license, and his ability to make a living in the future is going to be obsolete. He has no calluses on his hands. He has no marketable skills, and suddenly he realizes, yikes. And he's got a little bit of time and a little bit of resource to figure out, how am I going to secure my future? The story continues. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, and look what he says, people will welcome me into their houses. So suddenly he makes this connection that relationships are key. And maybe you cause him to go like, well, he uses people. Everybody uses people. I mean, right? Like, he suddenly makes this realization, like, my future depends upon the relationships that exist in that future. What am I going to do? Part of what he's beginning to do is recognize that his future is not tied to his possessions, but to people. Maybe that in and of itself is a radical thought for you to consider. So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first one, how much do you owe my master? Now, we don't know exactly how many, but we get a couple examples of what he does here. 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Now, that's pretty bold. He says to the guy, just cut it in half. Now, to me, it's interesting. He could have somehow embezzled the money himself. Notice that's not his approach. Instead, he wants to keep it in the relationship. He says to that guy, cut it in half, and the guy says to him, wow, that's awfully kind of you. If ever there's anything I can do for you. And he just kind of winks to himself, laughs, is amused by himself at this point. Then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, take your bill and make it 800. To which he said, well, wait a minute, the last guy got his reduced by 50%. Mine by 20? Just kidding. And this guy says, are you serious? Like, yeah, I have the power to do it today. Won't tomorrow, but I do today. And the guy says to him, wow, well, if ever there's something I can do for you, you just let me know. And the manager thinks, there will be, and it'll be sooner than you think. Now, at this point, like, put yourself in the manager who's frustrated by thieving employees' role. Like, The crowd at this point is like, this is going to be awesome because suddenly Jesus understands my plight, and he's always talking about poor people and under-resourced people, and suddenly he's just going to give me permission to crush them like a bug. People are leaning in. The master teacher is weaving this incredible story, not like the bad movies where you're like, I already know how it ends, I don't want to watch it. But they're like, whoa, what in the world? Because look what Jesus says next. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Now, I remember being a new Christ follower, reading my Bible and going like, okay, I'm out. I don't understand. I thought I got this, like honesty's good, dishonesty's bad. Jesus, he's commending this guy. Why? Because this guy understands he's got a little bit of stuff, a little bit of time, and he goes, wait a minute, but I've also got a future. What am I going to do in that future? He continues, for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I think it's kind of weird, people of the light, people of this world. What's the dynamic here? Here's what he's saying, and some of you may put yourself in this camp. What he's saying is, those of you in his crowd, maybe in this crowd, those of you who think that all there is to this life is this life, those of you who think that once you die, it's like game over. There's nothing beyond this life. They put you in the ground and everyone cries and that's the end. Those of you who believe that, he says, you understand better the purpose of possessions than to people who believe that after this life, there's another life, that there's life after death. And he's calling them out. Why? He's beginning to point out, like, wait a minute, those of you who, you see your possessions as a resource for what? Golden crowns? Bigger houses in heaven? That's the part of this passage that gets tricky to me. No, that's not the connection at all. To relationships that you will utilize, you will benefit from. They'll be in your favor. He continues, I tell you, in case there's any question what I'm trying to say here, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. You could build a cult off of this verse if you wanted to, because the implications are so radical compared to what we're used to thinking about. Because notice what he says is, hey, your resource now, you should invest it in such a way so that when you die, there's somebody there who welcomes you in. Now, can you carry that thought too far? I think so. But on the other hand, and to be honest with you, part of where I've kind of had to part ways from the research that I've done is, listen, a guy with a microphone and a salary who depends upon those buckets, I want this story to be about tithing. I just do. It's kind of not what it's about. Like, the message is about using what we have to invest relationally, which would seem to imply that if our tithing doesn't have a relational component to it, then we better find a place where it does. Jesus is going, no. It's about relationships. Now, I kind of want to zoom out here and hit pause, because the last thing I'd want this weekend to feel like is any kind of a rebuke. In fact, what occurred to me as I sat with this passage over and over and over again this week and studied other people's thoughts on it and understood them, the realization was, wait a minute, this is who you are. The reason we are where we are today is because of the number of people who get this. And some of you have a little bit, and some of you have a middle bit, and some of you have a lot bit. But the reason we're able to gather like this, the reason we'll be able to build a wheelchair ramp, the reason we'll be able to split firewood, the reason we can raise money for trails in our community, the reason we've been able to do everything we've been able to do up to this point, and especially sustain things as growth has happened, is because people like you get this. That you're always investing in relationships. And sometimes it's not even a relationship you get to have. Sometimes it's the relationship Kate gets to have with somebody, but she gets to buy them a cup of coffee because you've made that possible. Listen, if you're a guest, one of the things that would be impossible for you to know is that you are surrounded by some of the most get-this people you will ever meet. Like, this place happens, not because there's a trust fund, not because there's a tree in somebody's backyard, not because there's a single wealthy donor who makes it all happen. It happens because people get this. You get, this. Please don't hear a rebuke here. In fact, one of the tricky dynamics is even if you are a regular here, you wouldn't even necessarily know who are the get-this people, even though there's lots of them, because I don't necessarily either, because nobody knows. The IRS makes us make sure that somebody knows. They're the business managers. They're the only person that knows. But rest assured, this happens because you get this. And so listen, my point here isn't a rebuke. My point here is a response to drift. Like maybe way you think about this is like the 1-year annual checkup minus the latex glove. Just saying. That generosity is something that is easily drifted out of. That putting a value on relationships is an idea that is certainly an ideal, but one that's easily forgotten. And it seems to me that part of the role of the prophetic voice of the church is to constantly cause us to go, wait a minute. It's relationships that matter. That's the only thing that goes with us. Relationships are what secure the future, not money and the supposed security that we think that it brings. He continues, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. I mean, what is this, like some kind of Confucian proverb? Hold on, I think I skipped a question, didn't I? I think really, one way to frame it is just that this, what if Jesus is inviting us to see our stuff as a relational tool? And what would that say if we began to understand that everything is a tool for relationships in some capacity? Now, Jesus continues in verse 11. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, so now he's making a distinction between what we have now, and he continues, if you've not been, who will trust you with true riches? Now this gets a little crazy, but he's now distinguishing the stuff piece from the people piece, the now piece from the eternal piece. Here's one way I think we can look at this, is because, right, like I look at my little bit, and then I look at somebody else's little bit, and I go like, you got a lot bit. And then sometimes I look at my little bit, and I look at somebody else's little bit, and I go like, wow, I got a lot bit. But the point Jesus is making, like, ain't nobody got much. There's a whole different dynamic in play here. In fact, another way to say this is, what if God is inviting us to see our stuff as a relational test? Listen, it's sexy in our culture to say life is about relationships. We generally agree with that intellectually. Jesus seems to be saying, no, but the way you use your stuff, that's what really speaks to the priority you're giving it. He continues, and if you've not been trustworthy with somebody else's property, who will give you property of your own? Here's one of the terrifying things about Jesus. And if you're someone who's thinking about following him, this might give you pause. The thing he brings up more than any other thing, the concept he brings to the table more than any other concept, more than heaven, more than hell, more than salvation, more than all the things that you might think are there if you watch CNN or Fox and the way you are all led to be understood by popular media, the thing he brings up more than anything else is how you use what you have in this life translates to the future. That generosity matters beyond this life. But I think the challenge of this passage, and I know for me, I'm still trying to reconcile, the thing easily missed is it's bigger than just dollars and cents. It's relationships. You know, the part of the way I'm thinking about this is, you know, when I send my $30 to Families with Heart in Ecuador, I don't have any relationship with those people. But Nareem O'Leary does. And that's what makes it make sense to me. Jesus isn't just saying like, hey, create for yourself some crowns. He's saying, no, invest for the sake of relationship. He continues now, no one can serve two masters. Either you hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. To which we go, finally, something I can understand. We're going to talk about Satan, because he's been messing with my copy machine, he's been messing with my front driver's side tire, and now he's messing with us. It's not what Jesus is talking about. Many of you, you're not laughing because you're like, I've read my Bible enough to know that he's not talking about that. You cannot serve both God and money. Now, going back to our very first series, we did a series called Toxic Views, or what was it? Christian Detox, something like that. And we said even then, like, Jesus isn't after your money, he's after your heart. Jesus is here. Here's another bit of bad news, I think, and something that's worth reminding ourselves, that in Jesus' view, the single greatest inhibitor to your heart belonging to God isn't Satan. It's stuff and how you view it. Because, see, God has established a precedent. He values people. And if the way we view our stuff doesn't connect to valuing people, then he's going like, that's going to get in the way. Now, the religious people at this point, they're kind of crossing their arms. They're getting ready to leave. Watch what happens here. Now, he said to them, Or verse 14, the Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. So they're ticked. They're like, yeah, I heard it all before. He said to them, you are the ones who justify your hearts, justify yourselves in the eyes of others. In other words, he knows the games we play. Like, yeah, I would give more if, and I would give more if it didn't look like you already had so much, and I would give more if they didn't waste it, and I'd give more. And listen to what he says. Go ahead, next slide. But God knows your hearts. See, there's this idea of it being a tool, and there's this idea of it being a test, and it seems like there's this other idea of it being a trademark. Jesus goes, how you view your stuff is a trademark. It's a test of what you really value. You know, the good news here in my mind is like generosity, it's not a financial issue. And that might be offensive to you, but the reason I feel comfortable saying that is because rich people aren't generous. And poor people aren't generous. And middle-class people aren't generous. You know who's generous? Generous people. You've met rich people who, despite the way they're often caricatured, they're incredibly generous. And you've met people with a lot they fulfill all stereotypes. And you've met poor people who are stingier than anybody you've ever met. Richard Foster, this great Quaker thinker, said years ago, he said, one of the great lies of our age is that because you're poor, you're generous. And he goes, no. Some of the most greedy people in the world are poor people. And you've met poor people who are generous. You've met middle-class people who value nothing but themselves. And you've met middle-class people who are extraordinarily generous and relationally minded. See, Jesus goes, wait. It's not a money issue. It's a priority issue. So here's one way to think about this. We're moving into Christmas. And if we're not careful, we buy a bunch of things to fulfill a relational obligation. I wonder, how would Jesus maybe have us think about that a little bit differently? Like, what if our gifts and our giving, even as it relates to Christmas, that there's this very intentional connection to relationship. Chris Say, a thinker out of Houston, Texas, used to say years ago, I'm sure he still says, give relationally. What is that? I'm not just going to give something like, hey, I got these earbuds at Black Friday and they're $30, but I got them for $5 and I thought they'd be perfect for you. No. No offense if that's your style. He's going, give something that's a piece of you, that furthers relationship with you. You know, bottom line is what he's getting at is he's going, all of us, we all have a little bit of time. And some of you understand better than the rest of us that it's just a little bit. I have a friend who said to me recently, I hurried my way to 65, and I'm trying to stop hurrying now. We all have a little bit of time. And we all have a little bit of money. Hopefully yours is real. And Jesus is going, and you get to choose. How are you going to invest that? Listen, I hope that you lean into generosity. And I hope that you understand generosity as a relational tool. And listen, if giving around here isn't a relational thing for you, please find a place that it is. But even aside from your 10% or your 5% or your whatever percent, what if we understood that everything we had, our car and our house, everything is an opportunity to strengthen and invest in relationships? You know, some of you are here and you're still trying to place Jesus and who he is and what his priorities for the world really are. And I think this word generosity captures him better than anything. We often don't call it that. We often call it grace, but that's what grace is. It's generosity. It's God prioritizing relationship with you despite what you otherwise deserve. And the Christian life is one where we become profoundly amazed at a God who keeps heaping blessing on us despite what we deserve. And hopefully at some point there's an aha moment where we look at the cross and we look at the empty tomb and we go, wait a minute, the invitation of my life is to stop being a taker in the world and to start being a giver, a grace dispensing machine. And that's this whole thing called the Christian life. Understanding what does it mean to be a representative, a conduit of God's grace in this world. I'd like to pray, and we're going to sing our way out. God, Lord, so many dynamics here as we think about Christmas and budgets and giving, all the different dynamics. God, I suspect I'm not alone where I can very easily articulate and pontificate a value system that says that my life is about relationships, and yet living that out is another thing entirely, God. So as we think about parents and their kids and husbands and wives, friends, in-laws and aunts and uncles and siblings. And then we think about strangers and people that we may never meet, and yet the opportunity we have to invest in them through another person who has relationship with them. God, would you provoke us to think about what it would look like to give greater priority to relationships? Lord, maybe even in our chair time tomorrow, would you bring us back to this whole narrative and just do a little audit on where our priorities lie? Jesus, we just confess to you that we drift, and it's so easy to do. Thanks for your grace, pulling us back to yourself. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.